after a wonderful week-long honeymoon. I was excited to finally come home, but as I approached the house, I heard strange noises coming from inside. My heart skipped a beat, and fear crept in. What if someone had broken in while we were away? "Did you hear that?" I whispered to my husband, Nick. "What if there's someone inside? Should we call the police?" Nick, calm as ever, smiled and said, "It's fine." Without hesitation, he walked to the door, reassuring me with every step. Reluctantly, I followed him, bracing myself for what we might find. To my surprise, it wasn't burglars inside the house. It was my mother-in-law and sister-in-law. Relief washed over me when I realized they weren't intruders. They explained they had come to take care of the house while we were away. Nick had given them the key to ensure everything stayed in order. I had assumed they would leave before we got back, but apparently that wasn't the plan. Trying to be polite, I gently suggested, "It's getting late. Maybe you should head home." Instead, they brushed it off, saying, "Let's take it easy today." Before I knew it, they had taken over the living room and even started using our shower without asking. I thought they might leave the next morning, but when I woke up, they were still there, showing no signs of leaving. By the time I came home from work that evening, they were firmly settled in. I couldn't stand it anymore and asked Nick to tell them to leave. To my shock, his response was, "We're all living together now. If you don't like it, you can leave." His words hit me like a ton of bricks. He was asking me to leave instead of them. Left with no other choice, I packed my essentials into a small carry-on bag and walked out the door. It felt surreal, but I knew I had to stand up for myself. My name is Rachel. I'm 31 years old and work as an editor at a magazine. 4 years ago, I met Nick through a mutual friend. Before him, I hadn't had much experience with relationships. I was drawn to his confident, dependable nature, which was so different from my own. He was the first to say, "I love you," and after 4 years of dating, he proposed. We got married and started building a life together. While planning our wedding and house hunting, Nick seemed so reliable and organized. He made everything feel effortless. But now, as I walked away from the home we were supposed to share, I realized things weren't as perfect as they seemed. This was a turning point I never expected, but I knew I had to take control of my own happiness, even if it meant starting over. Living in our new house with Nick was supposed to be a dream come true, but his mother, Jenna, and his sister, Miriam, quickly became my biggest challenges. Nick's father had passed away about 11 years ago, leaving Jenna and 29-year-old Miriam as his only immediate family. Before we got married, I worried about how well I'd get along with them. We'd had only minimal interactions, and I hoped to maintain a polite but distant relationship. Unfortunately, things didn't go as planned. After the wedding, Jenna and Miriam began to intrude on my life in ways I hadn't anticipated. Jenna called me nearly every day with complaints or requests. "Can you increase my allowance just a little bit?" she'd ask. "I can't live a decent life with the current amount. Just $300 more would be enough." I always directed her to Nick, reminding her he managed the finances, but she didn't take it well. "You're supposed to take good care of your in-law or karma will come back to you," she'd scold. She refused to acknowledge my reasoning, blaming me for her financial woes. She also pressured me to visit her more often, help with her chores, and send her favorite foods every month, calling these obligations of a proper daughter-in-law. While Jenna bombarded me over the phone, Miriam had her own way of intruding. She often showed up unannounced, usually when I was cooking dinner. "I was in the neighborhood, so I thought I'd drop by," she'd say, making herself comfortable on the sofa. "Is dinner ready yet? I'm hungry. Please hurry up." Once she ate, she'd leave without offering to help or even a thank you. I asked her several times to let me know before visiting and not to come so often, but she brushed it off, saying, "Don't mind me. I'm just stopping by. You can feed me whatever's available." It was exhausting to deal with her, but I avoided being too harsh since she was Nick's sister. When I finally told Nick how unhappy I was with their behavior, he spoke to both Jenna and Miriam. Though he warned them, I didn't react too strongly against him, hoping things would improve. 7 months into our marriage, Nick and I finally went on our honeymoon. Work schedules had delayed the trip, but we were thrilled to take a break and explore Europe together. The week-long trip was everything we hoped for, full of adventure, relaxation, and an escape from daily stress. When we returned home, refreshed and ready to settle back into our routine, an unsettling surprise awaited us. As we approached the house, we heard strange noises coming from inside. My heart sank. What could it be? As we approached the house after our trip, I felt uneasy. Strange noises were coming from inside, and my heart started racing. Did you hear that? I asked Nick nervously. What if there's someone in the house? Should we call the police? Nick, however, didn't seem worried at all. It's all right, he said calmly, walking toward the door. I followed him hurriedly, bracing for the worst. To my relief, it wasn't a burglar. Instead, it was Jenna and Miriam sitting in our living room. I let out a sigh, thankful they weren't intruders, but my mind quickly filled with questions. Why were they here? Oh, you're back, Jenna exclaimed. Did you bring me a souvenir? What about the bracelet I asked for? Did you get it? I shook my head. Of course not. It's too expensive. While I stood there, the three of them started chatting cheerfully, completely ignoring me. Finally, I interrupted. Why are you guys here? Jenna looked at me, raising an eyebrow. Are you trying to say our presence is a nuisance? An empty house is an easy target for burglars. While you were on vacation, we went out of our way to protect it. You should be grateful. Nick explained that they had offered to take care of the house while we were away, so he gave them a key. When I asked why he didn't tell me, he shrugged. It was a last-minute thing. I didn't have time to talk to you about it. What's done is done. So I tried to focus on the silver lining. At least the house hadn't been broken into. But as I looked around, I noticed something alarming. Every room was a complete mess. Miriam's clothes were crammed into the closets, and what didn't fit was piled on the floor. In the living room, there were bags, remote controls, comic books, and random items scattered, not only on the table, but all over the floor. The house looked like a storm had blown through it. After a long flight, I was too tired to deal with the mess, but it frustrated me to no end. Still, I hoped they would leave soon. It's getting dark, I said, trying to hint at their departure. Shouldn't you go home now? Let's take it easy today, Jenna replied casually. To my dismay, they not only stayed, but also completely took over the living room. Miriam even decided to take a shower without asking, acting as if this was her home. They made themselves far too comfortable, and I could feel my patience wearing thin. It was clear they had no intention of leaving any time soon. I assumed Jenna and Miriam would leave the next day, but to my dismay, there was no sign of them leaving the next morning. They were still there when I returned home from work that evening. They were comfortably settled in, as if they had no intention of going anywhere. I mustered the courage to tell them it was time to go. It's time for you to head home, I said as politely as I could. Jenna waved her hand dismissively. We're family. You don't have to mind us. Just pretend we're not here. Despite their reassurances, I couldn't ignore them. I was the one cooking, cleaning, and doing all the laundry while they lounged around. I felt like a guest in my own home. If I didn't do something, they would stay indefinitely. Determined to resolve the situation, I decided to ask Nick to intervene and get them to leave. While I waited for him to come home, I started cleaning my room. That's when I noticed something alarming. One of my treasured perfumes was missing. It was a limited edition fragrance that was no longer available and had cost over $400. I had been using it sparingly to make it last. Panic set in, and I immediately questioned Jenna about it. She seemed genuinely clueless. I didn't even know you had perfume, she said. When I turned to Miriam, her response shocked me. Oh, I have it, she said casually, pulling the bottle out of her bag and handing it to me. The perfume bottle was nearly empty. My careful efforts to conserve it were wasted. "It smells good, doesn't it?" Miriam said with a smirk. My friend liked it too, so I lent it to her. I stared at her, dumbfounded. There was no sign of remorse or an apology. My frustration boiled over. "Why did you use it without asking me? What you've done is theft. Didn't anyone ever teach you not to take things that aren't yours?" Miriam rolled her eyes. "What the hell? I only borrowed it for a moment. Why are you overreacting?" "If you just borrowed it, then give me back what you used." I snapped. "Fine," she said with a shrug, "but it's already used, so I'll give you half the money." "I don't want the money back. I want the same perfume replaced," I replied firmly. "You're so mean. It's just a stupid perfume," Miriam retorted, pulling out her phone to look at the price. Her eyes widened as she exclaimed, "Holy cow, why is it so expensive?" Her attitude shifted as she realized the value of the perfume. "Are you crazy for spending $500 on perfume? If it's so important, why didn't you keep it locked up?" "It's valuable to me," I said, trying to stay calm. "That's why I used it sparingly and only inside the house." Miriam's lack of respect and understanding only deepened my frustration. This incident was the final straw, and I knew something had to change. I never imagined I would have a relative who would invade my personal space and use my belongings without permission. Yet here I was, facing exactly that. While Miriam and I were arguing about her misuse of my perfume, Nick came home. "What are you two making a fuss about?" he asked, clearly annoyed. Miriam jumped in before I could respond. "Listen, Nick, I only used a little bit of her perfume, and she's calling me a thief." She stomped off to the living room, leaving me frustrated. I pulled Nick into the bedroom to explain what had happened. I poured out my frustrations, telling him how I was at my breaking point. "I can't take this anymore, Nick. I want them out of this house." His response left me stunned. "Don't get so worked up over something so small. And there's something I haven't told you. They're staying here permanently. We're all going to live together." I stood there, mouth agape, trying to process his words. "Why didn't you discuss this with me?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Do you own this house?" he snapped back. "I'm paying the mortgage too, you know. Besides, my mom's house is old and falling apart. She's been thinking of moving out or repairing it. Since we have spare rooms, she decided to sell her house and move in. So if you don't like it, you can leave." His words cut deep. Not only had he made this decision without consulting me, but now he was dismissing my feelings entirely. I felt something shift inside me. My love for him was fading fast. "I understand," I said quietly. Without another word, I started packing the bare necessities into my carry-on case. Nick didn't try to stop me. Instead, he muttered, "You're so immature, running away after a fight," before walking out of the bedroom. As I packed, Jenna and Miriam stood by, grinning smugly. Their satisfaction only fueled my determination to leave. I locked the door behind me as I left the house, feeling a strange sense of relief. I had no intention of ever returning. I checked into a hotel and called my boss to request a few days off to get my life in order. During that time, I started looking for an apartment and explained the situation to my parents. When I told them my plan to divorce Nick, they were supportive but concerned, asking what my next steps would be. While I was sorting out my plans, Nick sent me a single text. "When you're ready to apologize, you can come back. Mom and Miriam said they'll forgive you." That text confirmed everything for me. I called him to formally ask for a divorce. At first, he resisted. "You're divorcing me over something like this. You just have to put up with it a little longer," he argued. But as I made it clear that my decision was final, he eventually relented. It was over. The life I thought we'd build together was not what I wanted. And now I was ready to start a new one, free from the weight of living in someone else's shadow. I was determined to move on, and agreed to the divorce without hesitation. From that point forward, Everything proceeded smoothly. The divorce was finalized in 7 months. I wanted to sever ties with Nick as quickly as possible, so we settled the division of property swiftly. I decided to give him the house. After all, we had been married for less than a year, and now we were officially divorced. My friends and coworkers noticed a change in me and were curious about what had happened. At first, I shrugged off their questions, unable to share the details. But as I processed my feelings, I decided to open up about everything. When I told them the full story, their reactions were a mix of shock and sympathy. "That's unbelievable," they said. "I'm so sorry you had to go through that." Their support and understanding made me feel lighter, as if a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. After I started living alone, I threw myself into my work like never before. With fewer household responsibilities, I took on 4 times as many projects and even helped my overwhelmed colleagues. My boss expressed concern about my sudden increase in workload, but I reassured them I was fine. The truth was, when I was alone, the painful memories of my past kept resurfacing. I began blaming myself for everything that had happened. Work became my escape, a way to drown out those thoughts and focus on something productive. One day, about 6 months after the divorce, Nick called me unexpectedly. I had left most of my belongings behind when I moved out, so I assumed the call was about those items. Initially, he made small talk, asking what I was doing and if I was living alone. His tone was hesitant, which was unusual for him. Nick was typically straightforward and impatient, often getting cranky if someone took too long to get to the point. Growing tired of the conversation, I asked bluntly, "What do you want?" After a pause, he said, "I want us to get back together." I felt no hesitation in my response. "No," I replied firmly and moved to hang up the phone. "Wait," he exclaimed, sounding desperate. "There's something I haven't told you yet." "What is it?" I asked, my patience wearing thin. "I'm busy, so make it quick." He hesitated for a moment before finally admitting, "Can you lend me some money? I'm struggling to pay the mortgage. It used to be covered by both of us, and now." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. After everything, he had the audacity to ask me for help with a house I had willingly given up just to be free of him. His request only solidified my resolve to keep moving forward and never look back. "I'm sorry," I said, "but that's not my responsibility anymore." And with that, I ended the call, ready to continue building the life I deserved. I understood that it must have been difficult for Nick to manage the financial burden alone. However, I also knew the amount he was struggling with wasn't insurmountable. He explained that he had been expecting a raise a few months ago, but it never materialized. To make matters worse, his performance reviews indicated there was no chance of a raise in the future. Frustrated, he decided to look for a new job, hoping to find one with better pay and conditions. Unfortunately, the reality was far from what he had imagined. The only opportunities available offered lower salaries. He had managed to secure a new position, but regardless of his reasons, I had no intention of lending him money. "Don't call me anymore," I told him firmly. His response was condescending. "You're still single, right? No one's going to want a not-so-young divorcee. You'd better come back to me." "No, thank you," I replied curtly before hanging up. After the call, I couldn't help but reflect on my past decisions. I wondered why I had ever fallen in love with Nick or agreed to marry him. I felt deeply disappointed in my own judgment. Not long after, both Nick and his family, Jenna and Miriam, began harassing me. Through my interactions with them, I discovered their misconceptions. They had assumed Nick was earning a substantial income because we had purchased a new house and had a grand wedding. When their allowances weren't increased, they blamed me, believing I was preventing Nick from giving them more money. They were initially thrilled when I left, thinking they could live comfortably without me. But reality soon hit them when they realized Nick's salary was much lower than they had anticipated. When the life they had envisioned started slipping away, they panicked and began calling me repeatedly. They seemed to believe that men always earn more than women, but the truth was that my salary had been higher than Nick's all along. although I wanted to block them all. Nick knew where I worked, and I feared he might call or even show up in my office. So I reluctantly answered his calls on occasion. During these calls, Nick often complained about Jenna and Miriam's excessive spending. He admitted he had run out of savings and that his family had been forced to take on part-time jobs. However, their spending habits meant they could never make ends meet. His calls always revolved around money. I decided that if I told him I was also struggling financially, he might stop bothering me. One day, as usual, Nick called to say, "I need a loan. I don't have enough to pay the mortgage this month." This time, I responded differently. "Actually, I'm going to resign from my job soon. I've already spent most of my savings," I said, hoping it would put an end to his constant demands. Nick's voice was tense on the phone. "You want to lend me some money? If you think I'm lying, you can ask someone at work." I had no intention of lending him anything. Hearing my firm refusal, Nick simply said, "I see," and hung up. That was the last time he called me. Later, when I shared this with a friend, she revealed that Nick's situation was much worse than I had known. He had managed to secure a new job, but it paid significantly less. Most of his income was eaten up by the mortgage, leaving him struggling to make ends meet. On top of that, Miriam's personal life had spiraled into chaos. She had an affair with the manager of her part-time job, which led to a massive scandal. The manager's wife discovered the affair and filed a civil claim against Miriam. Initially, Miriam claimed she didn't know the manager was married, but text messages revealed otherwise. She had even known his wife was pregnant and had pursued him regardless. The fallout was severe. The manager divorced his wife, and Miriam was ordered to pay a hefty compensation. Her friends distanced themselves, and she lost both her job and social circle. Meanwhile, Nick's family was burdened not only with the mortgage, but also with the debt stemming from Miriam's lawsuit. Their lives revolved around repaying debts with no end in sight. Jenna, too, was frustrated, lamenting to anyone who would listen that her peers had grandchildren while her children were still single and struggling financially. Nick confided in one of our mutual friends, complaining about daily arguments at home. He often whined about being single and claimed women no longer noticed him. His stress had taken a visible toll. He looked disheveled, had lost weight, and appeared older than his age. "What woman would want him now?" my friend remarked, rolling her eyes. This friend, who had introduced Nick and me, felt somewhat responsible for the outcome. While she found his ongoing drama entertaining in a strange way, she stayed in touch with him partly to ensure he didn't try to reach out to me. As for me, my life had taken a positive turn. I had recently launched a web magazine with a university friend. Leaving my previous job, I invested most of my savings into building the startup. It was a small venture, and I had to handle many tasks on my own, but I found joy in taking on new challenges. The obstacles I had faced in the past gave me the strength to manage difficulties with confidence. I was also in a new relationship with someone I had met at work. He respected my feelings and gave me the space I needed. Through him, I realized that Nick hadn't been the decisive leader I once thought he was. He had simply been selfish. For months after my divorce, I believed I would never find happiness in love again. But now I've embraced a positive outlook and am focused on cherishing the happiness I found in my new life and relationship.